I'm delighted to see the Right Honourable Member back on the front bench in a leadership role. It does seem that the Tories have been going through leaders so fast, they've started at the beginning again. They're now so green, they're even recycling their leaders.
Welcome, Quiet Rioters, to Sunday School, the mini startup to the weekly upstart. I'm Alex Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith. All of our podcast episodes are available freely to all. No paywalls here, ever. But we do like to show our gratitude to those who contribute what they can. So, on the evening of Monday the 9th of December, we're having a little festive Zoom sit-down with our backers, during which they can simply ask us anything.
Nothing is out of bounds. From my best vegan recipe to Naomi's favourite opera singer, you are free to prod anything you are curious about and be told to bog off if you go too far. To be part of it, just head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod and sign up for a monthly stipend from as little as £5.
Every penny goes to making the content for you, and we appreciate it ever so much. Now, Alex, what are we going to talk about today?
This week, we're talking really about the latest developments in Ukraine and the involvement of the West in Ukraine and Putin's reaction to that. And we're also talking about the continuing fallout from the inheritance tax on farmers, or rather the inheritance tax on farmland, I should say.
Yeah.
Both those things are worth exploring a bit further.
I agree. And I guess we might also touch on the International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant and Mohammed Deif.
Definitely. Strangely, they straddle both those stories because they are a domestic comms bear trap, but also they're a big international story that does weave into Ukraine, actually, because, and I don't think this is acknowledged enough, the fact that there are two big conflicts raging at the moment in which the West is involved does matter. This week, America authorized the use of weapons it provides to Ukraine against targets inside Russia. European allies have followed suit. Indeed, Ukraine's military has for the first time confirmed the use of British-made Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory. The Russian ambassador to London says that the UK is now involved in the war. Nice how they've relaxed, at least, about calling it that, rather than persisting with a ridiculous limited special military operation.
Are you saying now that Britain is directly involved in this war?
Absolutely. Britain and UK is now directly involved in this war because this fighting cannot happen without without NATO staff, British staff as well.
But you are using Chinese dual-use technology. You're using Iranian missiles. You're using Iranian drones. You're using North Korean troops. So are you saying all those countries are now directly involved too?
You do not allow me to answer. It is
I'm just saying it can't work both ways, really.
I guess the question is, what does involved mean and what comes next? Putin is acting as if it's all water off a duck's back while simultaneously threatening to use nuclear weapons. And the problem, as ever, with dangerous strongmen is that past patterns are not a reliable guide to future behavior, right?
So do you mean that this is him having sort of used the threat of nuclear several times and then not even vaguely followed through isn't something that we can take for granted?
A threat is just a threat until it's not. So I think there is reason not to panic because his threats have been empty in the past, but there's also reason to be hyper-vigilant because we need to take him seriously always.
What about the White House? Biden is this sort of, very much lame duck in his last few weeks in office. Do you think he's sort of just trying to use that time for maximum effect before he leaves?
I mean, I think he's doing two things. He's trying to basically supply Ukraine with as much stuff as he can between now and January, but also he's trying to take steps that are a bit difficult to undo. Like, if you authorize the use of anti-personnel landmines, for instance, you can't really undo that. Do you know what I mean? You can't really say to Zelensky, go and dig them all up now. And so I think that's the pattern. And it's basically to try and put Ukraine in the best position possible.
On a firmer footing before Trump.
For the negotiation that will come as soon as Trump takes over, most think. What do you think about Russia's complaint that this marks a new level of involvement by the West? Putting aside partisanship, is that a fair complaint or not?
Well, it's a fact. And it's a fact that should have been a fact a year ago or 2 years ago. Yes, we're getting more involved, and we bloody well should have done it a lot sooner. When we did the live show with Mark Malloch-Brown and Matthew McGregor, I quoted Popper about the future is unwritten, and it's up to all of us to make sure we're part of writing it. A lot of people talk about Ukraine losing the war, albeit slowly, but Russia not being able to sustain the advance as things stand. And I don't think Ukraine is losing the war. I think they're simply not being allowed to win. And that is largely thanks to people like Biden, but also Scholz and, to an extent, the UK. So I think we can't really overreact at this stage. Yes, Ukraine is in a very fragile position. But when you look at the territorial gains Russia is actually making, they are minuscule. And Ukraine is trading land for blood. Russia is suffering horrendous loss of life and an economy that is in increasingly dire straits. And the ruble has not had a good week this week. Back to your earlier question of crossing a line or, the West getting overly involved because of his loss of life, he's having to rely on North Korean troops. They're getting support from Iran. So this is now very much a global war that lots of different allied groups are getting involved with, no matter which side they support. So, he can fuck off, basically. Yeah. And I think we mustn't give up now. We've got to keep on and arm Ukraine properly.
Do you know, I've heard two reports from very, very credible defense analysts this week that Russia has recently changed its tactics and is sending troops ahead of artillery. It is sending infantry ahead of artillery. I mean, I can't tell you in military terms how
devastating for that
cruel and inhuman that is.
Yeah.
They are literally using their people as fodder.
Yeah, it is brutal when you really look at the detail of how much blood has been spilt. It is horrific.
I have a lot of sympathy with the Russian people because I think they exist in an environment where they're propagandized and radicalized. They only see one side of the story.
Did you see the Kremlin spokesperson who was giving the press conference, and her phone rings halfway through and she answers it, and it's the whole conversation is picked up on her mic, and it is her being told how to answer the question that she's just been asked. That is the level of propagandization, and you're totally right that the Russian people will never be told what's really going on.
The other thing is that militarily, it never made any sense. We've discussed this before with Arthur.
Yeah.
It was bonkers to say that someone you're fighting can stand behind a notional line and fire missiles and drones at your capital, and you cannot retaliate because they're standing behind a notional line that says this is Russian territory. It just allowed Russia to have big bases just behind the border and constantly be launching mass attacks into Ukraine. So I guess it needed to happen, but it is an escalation.
Yeah.
There's no doubting that. The question is, how will Russia react? A lot of the smart money is that we will see a series of retaliations that are sort of not escalations, that stay below the line of this is an outrage. And I can't help but think that having two big bomb threats, one at Gatwick, one outside the US Embassy, the day after Ukraine confirmed a UK missile was used in that way, that can't be a coincidence, can it? And this is sort of exactly the kind of thing that we might see. The other thing that someone has pointed out that is very, very much in the Russian playbook is sabotage. We might see like a mysterious fire at a power station, stuff like that, or cyber attacks on the NHS, or, things like that will form a pattern in the next few weeks.
For sure, our security services seem to be on ultra high alert for that, and that is clearly what they are planning. With regards to the specifics of those two incidents you mentioned that happened on Friday, as I understand, Gatwick, they arrested two people in conjunction with this parcel, luggage, whatever it was, but they were released. And the US Embassy was sort of dealt with quite quickly in a controlled, whether it was explosion or whatever of the suspect.
They said they think it was a hoax.
Right. So whether they are hoaxes or overreactions to benign incidents, but because they are getting intelligence to expect something real, I think they know that something's coming. So they're going to have to be hyper vigilant with anything and everything.
And in many ways, Naomi, it doesn't actually matter which it is.
Because the disruption gets caused regardless.
Exactly. If you can pay someone to go and forget
leave
their
a bag
suitcase,
on a tube station platform every hour of the day.
It doesn't really matter if it's a real threat or if it's not. The disruption it causes will be real. If you can get someone to fly a drone near Heathrow, that kind of stuff, it doesn't matter. There are easy ways for an enemy state using hybrid methods to disrupt our daily lives. And I think we will see that. We will see that increasingly. And like you said, whether that comes through hypervigilance or whether it comes through actual malign intent, we will probably never be able to tell, and that's the point of it, I guess.
When I saw both those stories break yesterday, and immediately that was where my head went to, as I'm sure it was for most people. And then I thought to myself, have I just watched too much Slow Horses? Because I have binged all 4 seasons in a fortnight. Quiet Riot. Today's episode is sponsored by the wonderful people at Shopify. Alex, do you recognise that sound?
I can't say that I do.
Well, it is the sound of a sale on Shopify. I've been using Shopify for years to power the Best for Britain shop, and it's got me thinking that we definitely need to use Shopify for selling Quiet Riot merch.
Oh, and we're getting there, aren't we? We're very close to getting our first Quiet Riot merchandise up and running. I've seen some early designs. It feels like everyone but me has a side hustle nowadays. I don't even have a Substack.
Exactly. And Shopify, it just sort of like takes all of the hassle out of selling things. I don't know what we'd do without it at Best for Britain, because it's an all-in-one commerce platform. You don't need to learn any tricky coding or faff around with the back end of your website. It's very much plug and play, and it just works. And it means that you can just get on with selling things quickly, easily, and cost effectively.
I mean, for a small company like us, there's only the 3 of us. That's me sold, because the last thing I want to be doing is trying to manage yet another process. And I like the idea that Shopify can help you get selling across other marketplaces like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, not just your own site. Because I think that actually there is the potential for our merchandise to go viral. I really feel it in my bones, especially our range of Christmas jumpers. I think they will do very, very well. Plus, I hear that, unlike us, Shopify have won awards. And with an extensive business course library, they're just there ready to support a business in every way they need.
Quiet Riot listeners, Shopify want to help you to get selling as well. So they've got an incredible deal. You can sign up for a £1 only trial month at shopify.co.uk/Quiet Riot. That's all lowercase.
So go to shopify.co.uk/Quiet Riot to take your business to the next level today. I've been quite impressed by how strong Starmer has been on this. For Starmer.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
You know what I mean?
Praise there, Alex.
He is the master of the sort of mealy-mouthed nothing.
Yeah.
And he really has been quite strident on this. So I wonder if he senses that there is also a political opportunity for him here.
There is.
As there was for Johnson.
Totally. I wrote an article about it that was published in politics.co.uk a couple of weeks ago. There is a real opportunity for him to show leadership. And before people say to me, why does Britain always have to lead? Why are you going for the bombastic retorts of Johnson and world beating? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about showing some leadership so that others follow, because there is a vacuum. I think you've got perilous situations for both Scholz and Macron. Obviously, the Dems are licking their wounds in the States, and there is an opportunity right now for a leader who believes in the international rule of law and liberal democracy to strengthen international institutions, to show leadership on these issues, boldness and courage.
An issue on which there hasn't been that much clarity is the ICC issuing warrants of arrest against Israeli PM Bibi Netanyahu, his former now defense minister Yoav Gallant, and Mohammed Deif, the military leader of Hamas, although Israel say that he was killed in an airstrike in Gaza in July, but that's not confirmed. Now, Israel went straight to this is anti-Semitism. Some European countries have been quite strident, I guess, that if any of those three people lands on their territory, they will be arrested. The White House is saying this is an outrage and a false equivalent. And the UK is trying to traipse among the raindrops in between. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts really are that Netanyahu only has himself to blame. The isolation that Israel is sort of now beginning to find itself in, with perhaps the exception of the US, was very avoidable. And I think Jonathan Friedland had a very good opinion piece on this, where, you know, he was sort of saying the ICC didn't go after Blair for suspected crimes in Iraq or the US on similar charges in Afghanistan, because the ICC won't get involved if they think that that country has their own reliable justice system. And there's this principle in law that you'll know as a lawyer, Alex, of complementarity, by which the ICC will defer to the court of the country being accused if it's satisfied that any crimes will be properly investigated and pursued. And what Friedland is saying is that what Israel should have done was to establish a state commission of inquiry into the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. They didn't. And they didn't probably because Netanyahu fears an investigation will point the finger at him for leaving Israel exposed to the deadliest attack in its history, and that an inquiry would blow apart his strongman pretense that only he and he alone as Prime Minister can keep the country safe. So I do hope that the UK adds weight to its statement. What do you think?
I mean, the UK has kind of said that. We are signatories, and if they say we will abide by the provisions in the law, that's what they're saying, that we'd have to.
And it's what they're doing in government for inherited contracts from the previous government that the UK signed.
I think they are right to point out that this actually never arises as a real thing, because people who have had a warrant issued, they never go to a country that they know is a signatory of the relevant conventions and international treaties. the equidistance that we're currently trying to keep between the US and Europe is quite important. And this is where I think it does tie into, for instance, Ukraine. All of those things mesh together. You can't set yourself against the US on one issue, but then be asking for favors on another issue. Yeah. And so it is a difficult one to get right. I think they've got it broadly right because they've signaled that that's the law without saying, yes, Netanyahu would be arrested upon arrival at Heathrow, which would make for quite screeching headlines. What's happening in Gaza is horrendous. It is nothing short of horrendous. There was another bomb strike today, another civilian building flattened. How do you take out a hostile entity that is actually targeting your country and killing people in your country that is on purpose enmeshed in a tiny, tiny space with the civilian population?
Well, I think that there is a big difference between reaction immediately after the attack and where we are now. The blocking of military aid so extensively and bombing hospitals packed with civilians just because there were Hamas fighters underneath them, or allegedly, let's assume that there were. Even if there were, I think that becomes the tipping point, and that's his problem. To persist with the malnutrition of children, the blockading of aid, and the bombing of infrastructure, which is hanging on by a thread to support a civilian population, does change how people view the reaction.
You're absolutely right. And that's where I am instinctively. I'm just putting a little question. There is an ease with which we can be morally certain about situations in which we have no skin.
Of course.
That's all I'm saying. But you're right. You're absolutely right. How many civilians, 5 civilians, can be acceptable collateral damage to take out a whole munitions storage with 50 Hamas leadership sitting in it? But obviously, the more this goes on, it's diminishing returns. So how many civilians do you kill to find the remaining 2 or 3 people?
Yeah.
There has to come a time when the West goes,
enough.
You need to stop. You're done now.
Quiet riot. Now, Alex, we talked about the farmers' revolt with Kim Darroch earlier in the week. They're, of course, revolting against the inheritance tax changes. And it's still very much dominating the front pages, the airwaves, etc. And there seems to be a growing consensus from my read of it all among both those in favour and against that the government numbers are not quite what they needed to be before rolling this out. And whether or not that is true, the perception that they've cocked up the numbers is cutting through. So Portland did a poll this week. Now, caveat that it was a very small, just over 1,000 sample poll, although they say it is representative of the population. And I caught it on the National Farmer Union website, so I don't know if they gave the NFU early sight or whether it was the NFU that commissioned it or not. But 2/3 of the public do not think that the government has fully considered the impact of its planned changes on family farms. I don't know what the data said about farms in general, but when the question is posed about family farms, that's the reaction you get. Just 17% of voters trust the Chancellor most to tell them about the impact of this policy on farms, whereas 52% trusting, again, ordinary farmers to tell the truth. What is an ordinary farmer? And thirdly, the inheritance tax on farms is the joint most unpopular measure in the budget, tied with changes to pensions. So, Alex, you've been following it too. The issue that the farmers, I think, are getting most cut through with is this, that in order to pay the inheritance tax, a farmer who has inherited will have to sell off a portion of their land. and that this portion will be too small and expensive for a new farmer to come along and buy it up because it won't be economically viable as an agricultural piece of land. So as you pointed out on Wednesday, the Strutt-Parker research shows that that land would instead probably be bought up by wealthy individuals and used as a tax loophole investment without being put to proper productive use.
Yeah.
Have we seen the farming community say anything about what they would be prepared to accept? Or is it sort of, no, it has to be kept as it is or nothing at all?
No, and this is the difficulty for me. I am incredibly sympathetic. But first of all, roughly half, just over half of farms are tenant farmers. So they don't own the land.
They work it, yeah.
Sometimes on long leases. So half the farming is affected adversely by the presence of these perverse incentives, because if there is the alternative to sell the land for a much, much higher price, it puts tenancy costs up, puts the rents basically that they have to pay sky high. The second thing is that I get what you're saying about the polling, but as you know, I am always very cautious of the raw numbers. What I want to see is movement over time. And the only movement over time that I've seen, I think, on YouGov, who have done 2 of these polls, is that support is ebbing away from farmers. So even though it is still quite high,
well, that was my gut reaction, and
it is actually dropping.
And a YouGov poll will have been at least 1,800 to 2,000 people, because I wonder if the vast majority of people had no idea that farming had this exemption from inheritance tax, and all of a sudden this all being aired has made people who don't live in rural communities or farmland, who just wouldn't have had a clue, to sort of be like, why are they getting this when the rest of us aren't? And I think that actually came through quite strongly on Question Time this week too.
And Luke Trill ran a sort of experiment as well, where they did half the people without mentioning Clarkson and half the people with mentioning Clarkson. And his conclusion is that it didn't make a material difference. But support went from 57 to 51%, I think it was. So 6 points, I think, is a fairly material difference, even though you're still in a majority. Yeah. I feel emotionally manipulated, and I really dislike that. Question Time is a very good example of that. Everyone was basically attacking Labour for this, and their arguments were all basically rolling hills and blue skies and happy chickens and pure milk and having to get up 3 hours before they go to bed for 50p a year and being stewards of the land for the whole country, unless, of course, you happen to be on a country walk, or you stand against blood sports, or you want to save a hedge or install a couple of solar panels, then it's very much their land again. You have to have, I think, a better argument than no one should pay any tax on this land, regardless of why they bought it, what they're using it for. You have to have a better argument than just singing Jerusalem over and over again. Because I have an immense amount of sympathy for farmers who have had a shitty decade by any measure, although some of it is self-inflicted. We acknowledge that and put it to one side. Hate the con man, not the conned. And my advice to farmers and their organizations, in a very friendly and constructive way, is I think this shtick will wear very, very thin very, very quickly. Find an alternative proposal that does target those big lands, because if you rock up with Clarkson and Andrew Lloyd Webber and Farage and Dyson and say none of us should pay tax, I think that sentiment can turn against you very, very quickly. So you have to make some kind of distinction between small family farms that are actually small family farms and people who are basically taking the piss.
No, I agree completely. Liz Webster of Save British Farming says that since Brexit, we've seen a mass American-style industrialization of agriculture with the arrival of more than 200 mega farms. And these are the kind of, 30,000 hectare kind of size farms, very American in style. They're bad for the environment. They're bad for animal welfare. I think the one in Norfolk that is in Liz Truss's old seat, if they get permission to go ahead with it, will become the largest pig factory in Europe. She makes great points about all of that. She makes superb points about the impact of Brexit on the farming community, brilliant points about the detrimental impact of the Australia and New Zealand trade deals, has been sending warning shots about hormone beef and chlorinated chicken flooding the UK if we do some kind of deal with the US. She has made superb points about the supermarket price fixing around products that farms sell to them. And she's losing me on this point. So what I think you're getting to, and what I would love to see, is the farming community coming together and saying to the government, we need a new deal for British farming. We need you to get alignment with Europe on regulatory issues so that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is improved drastically in our favour. We would probably love you to renegotiate the Australia and New Zealand ones too. They should be talking to them about the practices of those that buy food from them to get a fairer deal. And hey, an inheritance tax threshold that is here rather than there, that you've put it. And I think that would be the obvious way to go. At the moment, the NFU seem to be digging in very hard on the inheritance tax. I think we should be asking the farming community to come up with their version of a new deal for British farming that keeps us well fed, that gets us trading again, and gives farmers, a much better price for the produce that they work so hard to do.
And also, I think it's another poor comms issue from the government. There was a very different way to frame this about protecting farmland from being bought up as an investment and not farmed, which actually would help younger people who want to go into farming and tenant farmers. And they need to do the modeling of what happens to the price of land if they remove that perverse incentive, right? Because the price of the land might go down, which means loads of these farms who would be above the threshold are no longer above the threshold. Ultimately, if you are holding on to an asset that is worth 10 million and it's only making you a return of 20 grand a year, it is only a matter of time before that financial reality impinges on what you would like to do with it, and you're forced to sell. That's not the government doing that. That is the thing the government is trying to undo doing that. So there was a much better way of putting this out there, and I don't think it should have been part of the budget, actually. I think that was a mistake. I think there was a better way to present that.
Well, on the comms issue, and we keep coming back to this, and the comms missteps by the government, Clive Lewis, who listeners will know as the Norwich Labour MP, considered to be pretty on the left of the party, of the parliamentary party, had a very good Blue Sky thread on much of this on Friday, and we'll leave a link in the show notes. And he said that we refuse to give a credible explanation for how we got here, other than it was Tory chaos. And the problem is, when the political and economic permacrisis continues, that won't be a viable explanation. By refusing to identify who the culprits for this state of affairs is, brackets, he means billionaires and wealth speculators, we fail to make a convincing narrative story that explains our predicament. And I think he's dead right on this front, because we're having to do this because of the hand we were dealt by the Tories and the mess that they created that won't wash forever. And also because of this sort of fear of really calling out the far right narrative that is, and we talked about this on Wednesday, hijacking a lot of these issues for their own ends. And we talked about the Together Declaration gang being part of that co-opting of the farmers' protests. So I would urge people to go and have a good read of that thread. I think he's dead right on this one, and it's probably wise advice for Labour comms people.
Quiet, riot. He's right. There is a gap in the narrative, and the gap in the narrative is this. You can say we are forced to do things that we wouldn't necessarily do had we not been left in such a bad situation. But that doesn't justify why you've chosen to do this and not something else. And Labour haven't done that on the whole. They've said we're having to make hard decisions because of the mess left, but they're not explaining their specific decisions.
You were following Question Time quite closely on Thursday for Best for Britain, and Daisy Cooper was on, being pretty, I would say, protective of the farmers. They do have a number of rural constituencies in their enormous cohort that they now have post-July. What was your view on the Lib Dem positioning around the farming issue?
I think it's got the wrong balance, to be honest. And I've been since contacted by Mark Pack, I think, who is the president of the Lib Dems. I didn't know Lib Dems had a president. How exciting.
He must be coming to his end of term. He's been president for a very long time.
Who sent me their position paper on this issue. And I find it quite interesting that the position paper on this issue says exactly the thing that I was complaining about. It doesn't mention what the threshold should be or what is a better way of targeting those investors that use buying up land as a way to park large amounts of money without having to pay inheritance tax. It just says no tax at all on farmers because we value the farming communities.
They're guardians of the environment. Yeah.
And because we are supportive of farmer workers, which again I understand, like if you squeeze farms will squeeze the workers who already work in quite difficult conditions. All of that is true, but what is lacking is your alternative. And I suspect the reason the alternative is lacking is because they are eyeing up more of those Tory-facing rural seats. They know that that's where their expansion mainly lies. But the problem is, we saw this under Clegg, right? It's the old, you can fool all of the people some of the time or some of the people all of the time, right?
Yeah.
These things eventually come back to bite you.
Well, not even eventually, every 5 years or so.
Like you cannot triangulate your offering specifically this way on X seat and a completely different way on Y seat. You can do it for by-elections, which is why Liberal Democrats tend to do incredibly well at by-elections. But when it comes to the next big national election, these contradictions cost you. And Mark said, we can't help who agrees with us. Yeah, okay, fair enough. You can't help that Farage agrees with you, or that Together agrees with you, or that Kemi Badenoch agrees with you. But actually, if you participate in an event that's organized by those people and you stand on stage with those people and say the same things as those people, then you do broadly align yourself with them. And because I like the Liberal Democrats and I think they fill a very useful space on the political landscape, I am horrified by the idea that they're going the Clegg route again, because we know what happens.
Well, they have a constitution, and the preamble to the Liberal Democrat constitution is pretty good. My personal preference is for the preamble to the old Liberal Party constitution, which is a little bit better. But taking at face value that this party, which is a very internally democratic party by comparison to, say, Labour and certainly the Conservatives, this is their North Star, if you like, the preamble. And in it, it says the Liberal Democrats support the widest possible distribution of wealth. And you mentioned Clegg, and during the Clegg years, I was very worried that he and his fellow travellers, colloquially known as the Orange Bookers, because many of them had chapters in the Orange Book, which was edited by Paul Marshall, who listeners may be familiar with. If not, go and have a quick Google. That they would try and remove that line from the preamble. And now I probably find myself thinking that its inclusion is increasingly absurd when so many of their positions, certainly from individual MPs, if not corporately, are against things like HS2, are against a lot of development of new homes in their area. And now this. When you look at the 72 constituencies that they now hold, the vast majority of them are in the least deprived third of all seats in the country. Yes, they have St Ives and North Devon and places that have very, large rural communities that really are in and amongst the most deprived areas of the country. But the vast majority of their seats are in these very, very affluent areas where their voters are incredibly wealthy. And I think, therefore, it is irresistible for them to take positions that align with their very wealthy voters.
It may be irresistible, but if it were the first time, I would understand it, but it's not the first time. There is actually a fairly recent historical example of what happens when they don't hold that center ground, when they sway too much one way or the other.
And it is worth pointing out that this is certainly not all Liberal Democrats, and a lot of Liberal Democrat members are very unhappy.
Really
with
annoyed.
The
Yeah, I've had loads of responses.
And there, it was ever thus that the party members who have a vote at the conference, and it's a kind of one member, one vote system for passing policy on the conference floor, generally tended to be to the left of the politicians. I think that is much less true than it was, but they do still make up a significant chunk of the membership. And so we are not saying for a minute that it is all Liberal Democrat members and voters, but it does seem to be the kind of prevailing headwind of the parliamentary party. Quiet Riot. And that is it for this week's Quiet Riot Sunday School. Please remember you can follow us on social media, including Blue Sky at Quiet Riot Pod, or email us on quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Oh, and Kenny was off this week as it was his birthday, and he kept it secret, the sly puss. So swing by his socials at Mr. Kenny Campbell and embarrass him in the funniest way to embarrass a British person, by showing him loads of love.
We love you, Kenny. And listeners, remember, if you value what we do and can afford to support it with a few quid, you can do so at ko-fi.com/quietriotpod.
Thank you for sharing your weekend headspace with us once again. Stay wrapped up warm as dirty Bertie batters Britain. We love you lots.
Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. We'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global. Quiet Riot.
I'm who am I again? Okay, now.
Do you sometimes feel like all you ever do is podcast?
Huge thanks to today's sponsor, Shopify. And remember to sign up for a £1 trial period at shopify.co.uk/quietriot, all lowercase.